2023 was the year I had finally decided to start learning Chinese through immersion, and beforehand I had only learned Chinese for a mere, I don't know, 12 years since I was a 5-year-old, and I still wasn't able to speak a slick of Chinese, and every single conversation just felt like gibberish. And during those times of those 12 years, it's what you probably might have expected. I'd usually go to some sort of weekly class, try to learn Chinese there. They usually drill stuff like vocabulary, grammar, and then, try to be able to get it into you and try to get you to practice by speaking. I also remember just many times in my father's car, he would just try to drill me on all this vocabulary and stuff. Worst of all, he also didn't even notice about tones. And the first time I tried to speak Chinese when I was in 6th grade, well, I messed up all the tones and I made a terrible mistake that I wouldn't forget for the rest of my life. But let's just go back to the point. Well, it's already 2023. I finally got the motivation to learn Chinese, so I decided to try to start with the good old method of grammar and vocabulary study like I've always did for more than a decade. And because of that, I didn't get anywhere and I was still struggling. However, recently, after this struggling, I actually had discovered what is called immersion. And not exactly the immersion that you're going to think about right now, where it's just like, hey, let's go to China, let's go to Taiwan, let's go live there, and then acquire the language that way. No, rather instead, you'd still do this all at home in your own country. You don't need to move anywhere or make any big plans, but instead, you would just try to focus a bit more on input, which would be listening and reading, rather than just trying to focus on all their time and just studying. And because I actually decided to shift a lot more time into just simply, just taking it slowly, just watching TV and playing video games like a normal native speaker would do in their target language or their native language. And then what happened then was that after around 3 months of just doing this consistently, I then took a trip to Taiwan with my family for the first time. And yes, my Mandarin still sucked. I still struggled to speak. Lots of conversations, still felt like super fast, and I still couldn't, do a lot of the things that would make me deemed as a competent speaker. But during that time, there was actually something that I had realized, which is my Chinese was actually the best it had ever been for just those 3 months of just simply getting lots of input. And because of that, I was actually just able to be, eye-open. It's just like, even though my Chinese wasn't that good, I actually was finally able to feel like this language is actually finally starting to stick with me. I'm actually starting to enjoy the language a lot more, and it just doesn't feel like every single time it just, feels like gibberish. It doesn't feel like every time that I'm not getting it at all. And it's finally felt like I've started to make some progress. So you're not actually going to get the same progress results as me because, 12 years of studying and 3 months of input, those 12 years of studying still at least made a little bit of an impact to those 3 months of studying. So just a quick disclaimer, you're actually not going to be able to get that results as fast as a snap after you just do 3 months of input. But I still really want to emphasize in this video that you probably are not treating input as importantly as it should. And you've also heard this story many times before as well, where it's like, let's say person is struggling in a language class, or let's say studying a language for many years. They're desperate and then they finally start inputting, and then because of their input, they actually get very good at the language that they're studying, and then get more motivation and then want towards that input more. You've probably already seen this story many times, and if you're the first person that has heard this story, this is actually going to be a very common thing you're going to see in many language learning spaces. And because of this, input is a lot more important than you think, and you probably should get more of it, especially if you're not right now. But even if you're someone that has been consistently inputting, I still really want to emphasize it to you. So let me go explain why input's actually a lot more important than you might have just thought. There's actually something in input that I have found that you really can't get anywhere else, which is simply a lot of context. And input gives you lots of context because compared to things like studying and speaking, is that you actually finally get to see the language come to life in a way. Because if we're going to be, let's say, reading something, you actually get to see words in their natural context. In another way, you could kind of think about like video game. There's going to be a difference between, let's say, reading about a video game versus actually playing the video game, where you can actually see how the characters interact with each other, how they fight, all your enemies, and the world, where you can never get if you only just read about the video game. It's a bit of a weird analogy, but it's pretty much just like language learning, where you can probably study as much of the language as you want, but no matter how much you study, it's not going to compare to actually, going out there and actually, interacting with the language in a meaningful level, because that's going to be a very important part of just, well, any sort of skill. You actually have to put in the practice, and input is a very important way to practice. But it's not only just this practice, because compared to speaking and, well, studying these two language skills, is that input actually tells you in sort of a unconscious way as well what is actually correct and what's not correct. Because language learning in a nutshell, if you don't want to again do all the details of it, it's simply just we're just trying to mimic a native speaker the best we can. And the worst thing that we can try to do is that we're going to try to pretty much get the language and just try to impose a lot of our native language rules on it. For example, I can give you an example with Chinese. Let's say, for example, I want to say hold on. One example I can give with Chinese is, well, this, being that this is a sentence structure in Chinese. And if I were to literally translate this into, well, English, this would be more like, I every day with my friends study Chinese. And this could be a little bit more, it could be correct, but it's not exactly, it doesn't exactly sound very natural. And if you wanted to have a more natural way of saying it, you'd probably say something like, I study Chinese with my friend every day. That would be a more natural way to say it. Instead of just saying, I every day with my friend study Chinese, you'd rather say, I study Chinese with my friend every day. And this is a phenomenon called language transfer. And pretty much it's just going to be the fact that we literally would impose our own native language into the target language that we're studying. However, if we were to get lots of input, this sort of negates this by a little bit, and by a little bit actually quite a lot, because you're actually trying to listen and know what the language actually sounds like and how it's actually correctly done. Because if we were to simply just try to get into just only studying and speaking, we're going to most likely try to impose a lot of our native language on it. It's not something that we would do intentionally, but it's something that we would default to when we're not exactly feeling when we're not exactly feeling the best today, and you're not going to have a lot of that conscious mind the building blocks of all these things. And it's not only just simply the context being very important. There are actually many things in input that can really, really help you. One thing I can give you is that simply being able to mimic a native speaker better, especially to do culture. You could definitely do this in some ways through speaking, but if we were to watch lots of TV shows and read lots of books, there are going to be a lot more cultural references thrown at us, and then we would soon have to pretty much get a lot of these mini culture shocks. And then because of that, we would be a lot more accustomed the culture of a language, because we've seen it in this context through input to just a lot of times. Not only that, but there can also be lots of connecting interests that you can also get yourself into, because you're going to be watching something in the target language of another language, and there's going to be many times where you're going to be immersing in things, watching things, reading things that are very interesting, and lots of other people and native Chinese speakers that actually would like them as well. And you could it can really open a way of actually connecting with people, because you actually have, you pretty much consume the same things as they do. And lastly of all is that there's also a big difference between written and spoken language, because if you want to be able to understand written language in Chinese, yes, it's actually very hard. Just look at this. But after a certain point, you actually might get to a point where you might actually think that reading can actually be slightly easier than listening. This actually sounds a bit shocking, because wait a minute, how is that possible? Because Chinese writing system, it's Hanzi, it's super hard, just characters, it's literally trying to look at pictures. But kind of think about it in a minute. If we take a look at other languages that don't have as hard as scripts, let's say, for example, Spanish. Spanish is going to be a lot easier to read, because simply you get to go at your own pace, and the words don't exactly change now, do they? Because the most a word can change is either the font it's in, or maybe perhaps, let's say, the size of it, or maybe, let's say, the spacing. There's not going to be a lot of changes in terms of, let's say, the text being written. And because we're able to, let's say, understand the text, understand what's at the text, it's going to be a lot easier to compare to spoken language. Where spoken language, we don't have a timer, or we can't just go on what's at our own pace. There's pretty much this hidden timer where it pretty much has to understand a person and that's talking to you. Not only that, but we also have to consider things, let's say dialects and accents that come with it, and all of these other things that spoken language that will be unavailable to just written language, that in order to actually be able to understand spoken language, you have to do that, well, lots of listening. Now, of course, you may say right now, but wait, I kind of already know that watching things in my target language is already good for me, but is there really any proof that input is really that beneficial as it is? Well, yes, and there's a lot of both anecdotal and also scientific research studies backing this up. But I'm not really going to explain too much about the details in all of them, but I'm going to go give you just a quick intro to the face of comprehensible input, Stephen Krashen. So I'll let my current self take over now. I'm just going to go explain briefly right now just the origins of input. I don't want to bore you with too much of the details, but input was a comprehensible input was popularized by this guy called Stephen Krashen, and just to explain in the most bro science way as possible, he had many theories regarding language learning, but we're just going to talk about two of them, being the input hypothesis and the learning versus acquisition hypothesis. The input hypothesis, which pretty much explains that we can acquire languages to what's called comprehensible input, pretty much input that's both fun and follows rule what's called I+1. I+1 being what you already know, and +1 being something that you don't know already. And this I being the things that you know can also come from things like, say, visual cues, and let's say the editing I'm giving you right now is probably going to help you understand more of what's going on. And that's pretty much the way in order to acquire languages. And what's the difference between acquiring and learning? Well, learning is what you would usually associate with, lots of drilling, lots of speaking, and that's what we would be learning a language. But acquiring a language is a subconscious process that can only be done through input. So, okay, that's pretty much all the details aside. And if you really are more interested in, Krashen and his studies, I'll link his study below in the description, where he pretty much has all his theories laid out, and then, well, you can go take a look at it for yourself. But now, of course, you may say right now, okay, this sounds all nice and dandy, input seems so important, but you know what? I could probably still do this with speaking. I can still be able to correct myself through speaking. I can still have these native conversations with speaking, learn the culture. I'm also going to be able to, as I get these corrections. Also with studying, yeah, I know that, Chinese sentence structure isn't supposed to go like this. I could study Chinese sentence structure. I can just be able to put words like this, and then I'll be able to learn that way, and then soon I'll be able to gain the intuition like that, right? Well, not exactly, because speaking, I'll go address speaking first, is that, yes, I'm not saying that speaking and studying are not important at all. In fact, I think they're quite important, and you should probably implant them in your own language learning routine. But it's definitely not a way to just completely replace input at all, or just try to use it as a substitute. Because here's the thing about speaking. If we want to first, let's say, speak with, let's say, another person, how are you able to speak something if you can't even understand it in the first place? But then you're going to be saying, oh, but you would just probably get more conversations too, and you then will be able to, understand more. But here's a big problem with that. When we're speaking, we're also occupied with another task, which is, trying to speak and trying to form sentences. And usually at this time, it's sort of like a performance thing, and because we're actually trying to perform the act of speaking, we also are not in this sort of low stress environment that we are supposed to be in when we are supposed to get lots of input. Because think about it. What does it take in order to get input? You just need a video or some audio in the target language, maybe some text, and then you just need to sit down there and listen to it. However, when you're speaking, you pretty much have to, let's say, play this ping pong where pretty much you speak and then you have to listen to them, and it's pretty much this high stress environment where it's not going to be as, easy in order to be able to do that. Eventually, you will be able to overcome this high stress environment. And let's say, for example, me, where I actually do have lots of fun with just speaking with people, but not only just that, but a lot of the speaking that you will produce and you'll have with people are usually just going to be strictly with daily life. And not saying daily life is an important thing, but if you want to be able to learn more vocabulary, you pretty much need to get lots of input from repeated sources. And simply just having conversations isn't just going to fulfill this requirement of just you doing it. In fact, it probably can be a lot more efficient in a way in order to just get lots and lots of input compared to just trying to have a conversation where half the time you have to speak, half the time they have to speak, where you're just going to be able to, in input, just pretty much be able to just have language wash over you as much as you can. And even it can come to things, let's say writing or just speaking yourself, which can be even worse, because in a way you can practice your speaking skills, but you're actually not going to get any input at all, because there's not going to be a partner that's going to be giving you some sort of input towards that talk about. And because of that, there's going to be a problem, because now you're only going to be practicing input, and the rate of words that you're going to be using or encountering is only going to be the words that you're going to be using and you already have encountered to, well, you guessed it, input. And then compared to input and speaking, in speaking, we probably can maybe encounter around maybe 300 words. Let's just say, I'm just making this up, you can probably encounter around 300 words around, let's say, after an hour of speaking. However, if we were to input for around an hour, it can probably be closer to around 3,000 or maybe even in the upper thousands, because when you're going to get lots of input, you're probably going to encounter a lot more words that you probably wouldn't have encountered beforehand. Compared to speaking, you're only limited to, well, your speaking ability right now, and also the time you also have to take in order to then be able to correct your speech afterwards. We definitely are going to be able to learn a lot more by simply just getting lots of input to lots of vocabulary and stuff. Now, what about studying? Because studying, as I already mentioned, doesn't exactly work in order to actually learn a word. Because if you want to be able to learn a word, well, even speaking can be a better way to do it compared to just studying, because studying, you're only just looking at the word. You're only trying to, let's say, memorize all the definitions. Let's say, for example, we're going to take a Chinese word, an abstract Chinese word, for example, qi. And qi can have many, many different definitions. It can mean air. It could mean being angry. It could mean, all these definitions I probably might just put up in here. And I'm going to just ask you, are you really going to study all the definitions here? Of course not. You're not going to be able to study any of the definitions of that. And this is what input does, which is, again, it comes in context. And because we have so much context in order to come off of, we're eventually going to slowly learn the word more and more as we see it in the proper context. And because of this, then after that, we're going to be able to use it properly in a good Chinese context. Then after that, we're going to be able to use the word and not have to rely on just simply trying to fit, is this the right qi, or is that sheng qi, or is that wo qi ni, is that... Okay, you get the point. That's it, is that you're not going to be able to just memorize all the definitions. But what about also grammar as well? Well, grammar is the same thing as well, where you can definitely try to study all the grammar you want, but it's never going to compare to actually seeing it in real life contexts and getting enough of those contexts to meaningful input, to simply, well, lots of input and interactions that you may even have during speaking, which is that there's going to be a point where the golden point was that learning any language, that you want to be able to learn a language without actually having to use it. And because not use it, but you actually want to be able to use the language without having to constantly think about it. And if you were to just only study the language, then it's literally only just thinking about the language, and you literally have to, let's say, translate every single thing. It's just going to be something that slows you down so many times, and you're not going to be able to have good conversations, because you're only going to be limited to the most common things that would pretty much have direct correlations to your native language. And if you're someone that has been struggling with this for a while, then I can recommend that you check out the first link in the description. It's my Mandarin reading course. And over there, I'm going to pretty much teach you not only just how to speak really well, but also how to get lots of comprehensible input in order to then be able to speak a lot and then pretty much have these meaningful conversations with Chinese people that you may meet. Back to the point being that, well, speaking and studying, although important, are usually just, well, shortcuts. Well, while speaking isn't exactly enough, especially with its higher stress environment and need to perform, we're not going to be able to exactly, well, get enough input in the moment in order to then just be able to relax and then, properly get it. But even then, if we were to just speak a lot more, it's more like trying to perform all the time without actually trying to put in the proper practice. However, then what about studying? Studying is usually a supplement, and it's not the actual way you can learn words or grammar by intuitively, well, internalizing it within you. Now, one of the biggest concerns as well with input, because you may already know all of this, you may already know that even as well, okay, input is always pretty much input is a very important part about learning, but why doesn't it work? And that's a bit strange because yeah, input works, but the biggest problem is that input is not easy, especially in the beginning, because it's actually a lot easier to actually start speaking and actually studying, because those are actually two very quick ways in order to improve in a language in the beginning. Because imagine we start speaking, it's going to be very easy to say the most common words. Let's say, for example, hello, how are you, what did you eat today, what's the weather today. These things you can get very, very quickly. For studying, it's going to be very, very apparent when you actually do have some sort of feedback loop. For example, it's going to be like, oh, I've learned this new word, and then it's very apparent because I have it written down. I've used it a couple times and was at the textbook, and yeah, it's very visual. It's very apparent to see that these two things can really show how much you've improved in a language very, very quickly. However, input is a lot more ambiguous. It isn't going to be something where you're going to be like, oh, next day, oh yeah, been able to watch more TV. That means I'm going to get better at language. Instead, you're not really going to see such a big improvement with input at the beginning. And this is why a lot of beginners also tend not to usually input in the beginning, or usually start to even question the importance of input in the beginning, because they're like, damn, I don't understand anything. It's like, am I really sure I have to keep inputting in the beginning? Or I think it's probably best that I maybe go study a bit more and just put input until I'm able to study a bit more. But this is mostly a trap, because in order to be able to listen and read to a good level, you're going to have to do lots of listening and reading focused exercises. And if you just try to simply study more, sure, it's going to make input a little bit easier down the line, but in the long run, you could probably see also a lot of people, and you could probably find this, where that if you try to only just study, let's say, the most 1,000 common words of the language and then go into input. Let's say, for example, you want to, watch finally a Chinese drama as a celebration after completing your 1,000 most common words Anki deck. You're not going to be able to understand anything, and it's going to be such a big demotivator compared to the person that was able to do both at the same time, where they're going to be able to study a little bit and also input a bit, and then soon they're then going to be able to watch a Chinese drama that they've always wanted. Because there's not going to be some sort of magic snap, voila, you can finally understand all of Chinese. It is going to be a slow process that you're going to have to do. Remember, it's subconscious. It isn't going to be something where you can just consciously learn, like studying or speaking, where you can finally just be able to say, I know how to say, how are you? I know the word for, cheese in Chinese, something like that. And then it's just going to take some time, and it is going to feel actually quite useless, because you're just going to question yourself many times. Is input actually worth it? Am I actually wasting my time? Because in many ways, it can really feel like you're wasting your time when you don't understand it. But trust me when I say this, you have to get input if you want to be able to learn a language and also be able to then understand things more later down the line, where you're going to have to do both at the same time, even though it is quite painful to do. Not only that, but it's also the key in order to get to the next level in many just different stages of language learning. Because not only you're just a beginner trying to get into the point where you can start understanding basic piece of content, but even as someone struggling, let's say, trying to get from upper intermediate to get into advanced, getting lots more diverse types of input that I can't understand myself is going to be quite crucial in order for me then to be able to get to the point where I can start understanding just lots of news, or probably even more advanced political, historical topics. And finally as well, how long and how much input would it actually take for you in order to learn Chinese? The answer simply is that we really can't say for sure, because there's also lots of variables. But if we're going to look at the FSI, which is also just the US Army Language Institute, where they teach languages to English speakers like us. If you're going to be English speaker, or your main language has been European one, it's going to take approximately around 2,200 class hours. And just to put this in perspective, every week they want you to do 23 class hours and also 17 hours of self-study. And this is a very intense program, and you can really imagine by simply you're going to also need lots of input in order to learn Chinese. It isn't going to be easy where you're going to be able to be able to just understand Chinese. It is going to take some time, but because as I made this video, I just really want to emphasize how important input actually is, and that if you don't get enough input, it could probably be such a big detriment in your language learning. Because ironically enough, this will take a long time, but if you actually don't put in the time that slowly get used to input, it's actually just going to make your language learning journey a lot more long and unbearable, just like how I did for the past 12 years. So yes, that's all I have to say. So good luck on your Chinese learning journey, and of course my my Chinese communication course in the description. And if you have any questions regarding language learning, then feel free to DM me on Instagram. I will reply to you. So thank you for watching.